And now, marine weather around Alaska.
First up, today's sea ice analysis showing it basically extending west to east here, well north of St. Paul Island and fair ways to the south of Nunivak Island. And the way it looks now, kind of a east-southeast flow week. Most of the ice flow will be drifting off to the west, at least for the next few days, the way it looks right now. So not much change out there expected over the upcoming week. And here for tonight, weakening front here, keeping cloudy skies with areas of moisture from Kodiak Island right on up into the Seward Peninsula. Breezy and showery for the Bering Sea. Dry with light winds, central eastern part of the state. Winds will start to increase along the Arctic coast tomorrow. And blizzard warning kicks into effect for the eastern Beaufort Sea coast for tomorrow through Friday evening. Winds pick up 50 miles an hour in gusts out of the east, and that'll reduce visibility to a quarter mile and blowing snow at times there. Better conditions off to the west. Light winds, another nice sunny day, central and eastern part of the state, right on down into the Panhandle. Increasing clouds a little bit, but still partly sunny skies, south central Alaska. Risk of a shower over the mountainous terrain in the afternoon, especially with the western Alaska range with the moisture associated with this front. Not much change over the Bering Sea and the Aleutians. And higher pressure over the western Bering and the western Aleutians here make for light winds, dry conditions, moisture, occasional rain, eastern Aleutians right on up into Kodiak Island. Remnants of this weak trough, which was the front. The front was in this position now, just washed out along the North Gulf Coast. Mostly cloudy skies with a chance of showers over the mountainous terrain, south central Alaska. Sunny for the Panhandle, central and northern interior, all the way up to the Arctic coast. Although those winds will continue to gust to 50 miles an hour over the eastern Beaufort Sea, or along the eastern Beaufort Sea. And for the marine forecast, northwest winds 10 knots here for the central and south coast. Light variable winds for the north coast at 5 knots. Southeast at 10 for Stevens Passage and Lynn Canal, as well as Clarence Strait. And for Friday, light variable winds over the inside channels there and waters at about 5 to 10 knots with slight seas. Northwest winds 10 to 15 knots out along the coast. And for Prince William Sound, light variable winds. Tomorrow for the day Thursday, light variable winds also for the eastern North Gulf Coast, western North Gulf Coast, northeast at 15 knots, east winds at 20 knots for the Barren Islands, and the Kamishak Bay area, Cook Inlet, variable to northeast winds at 10 knots. And for the day Friday, north to northeast winds, 10 knots for Cook Inlet, east winds 20 knots for Kamishak Bay and the Barren Islands, east winds of 15 there for the western North Gulf Coast. Otherwise, Prince William Sound and the eastern North Gulf Coast, light variable winds at 10 knots. Kodiak Island tomorrow, variable winds 10 to 15 knots. Variable winds at 10 for Bristol Bay and the Alaska Peninsula, south to southeast winds at 15 to 20 knots with 3 to 6 foot seas. And for Bristol Bay on Friday, east winds at 10 knots there. For the Alaska Peninsula, light variable winds at 10 knots. Pretty good day, really laying down there Friday. For the peninsula, east-southeast winds at about 20 knots for Kodiak Island. And for the eastern Aleutians, small craft advisories of southwest winds at 25 knots tomorrow. Central Aleutians, westerlies 25 to 30 knots. Western Aleutians, west winds 20 to 25 knots. And for the day Friday, western Aleutians, southwest and northwest winds at 15 knots, picking up to 25 knots there for Adak Island, Atka Island, and Nikolsky, becoming westerly at 25 for Unalaska Island. For the southwest coast Thursday, southeast winds 10 to 15 knots. Southeast at 10 for St. Lawrence Island, Norton Sound east at about 15 knots. St. Matthew Island east at 15 knots, and the Pribilof Islands, southeast winds 15 knots with 7 foot seas. And moving ahead to Friday for the Pribilofs, northeast winds 15 knots, northwest at 15 for St. Matthew Island, northeast winds at 10 knots for the Kuskokwim Delta Coast, Yukon Delta Coast, light westerlies at 10 knots, St. Lawrence Island, north at 15, and Norton Sound, light east winds at 10 knots. Up to the north, brisk wind advisory for the central, or for all of the Arctic coast, strongest here in the east. East winds sustained at 30 knots there for the eastern Beaufort Sea coast. Central and west side, east at 25 knots. And the Chukchi Sea, east winds 10 to 15 knots. And for the day on Friday, we've got east to northeast winds for the Chukchi Sea at only 5 to 10 knots, but brisk wind advisories continue for the Arctic coast there, 25 knots out of the east for the central and western coast. Eastern Wilbur Sea coast winds continue east at 30 knots.